second-year intern with Fairfax County Master Gardeners. And tonight we're going to talk about how to turn garbage into great stuff. So my title is Vermicomposting for the Home Gardener. And I'm not an expert, but I am a practitioner of vermicomposting. And I think that if you're a gardener, I think it's important that you think about, Okay. So vermicomposting is easy and it's environmentally friendly. The focus will be tonight on the benefits of composting with worms and giving you a get started type of introduction. I've been composting with worms, vermicomposting off and on for a number of years, first inspired by this library book that I took out called Worms Eat My Garbage. And that is sort of the Bible of the easy entryway into worm composting. And years ago, I took it out of the library when my kids were small in the 90s, did a little bit of it then, and then I lapsed and I didn't do vermicomposting for quite a few years. And in the last 4 years or so, I started up again. And things have changed a little bit. And I'll talk about that as we go through. So tonight, the benefits of worm composting and how to get started. The simple, easy way to do it. The question is why, oops, this always hops. Sorry, people. Why should we do vermicomposting? What's the benefits? First of all, when we're as gardeners, either with plants in your home or within the soil and the ground, really it's about the soil. Soil life is crucial to the development of healthy plants. And the trend now, and it has been for a long time, I'm sure, is that we need to promote long-term fertility in soil. We feed the soil rather than feeding our plants with a lot of chemical or organic fertilizers. If you feed the soil and create an environment for microbes and other sorts of life in the soil, that will help us create healthy plants and healthy gardens. So vermicomposting improves soil structure. The thing about vermicompost when it's finished is that there's a high concentration of organic matter. There's plenty of beneficial organisms, nutrients, and enzymes. I'm not really going to talk about the chemical things that go on, but there is a couple of resources at the end if you really want to dig deeper into how the microorganisms work to build a soil structure. You can do that on your own. I'm keeping it simple for entry-level vermicomposting. The other problem that we have just living on the planet is we produce a lot of waste, a lot of organic waste, especially food waste. And most of it goes right into our landfills. And by diverting the food waste that we create in our kitchens, we can create beautiful homemade compost. And the other thing about vermicomposting is once you get the system up and running, you can save a lot of money. You're taking your trash and making treasure with vermicomposting. Well, oh, this keeps jumping. I apologize. I've had this problem before. I'm sorry, people. So what do we need for vermicomposting? We have a worm. The Latin name is Eisenia fetida, and it's the compost worm. You might know it by other names: red wiggler, tiger worm, brandling worm, or manure worm. These are not earthworms. Earthworms are a different category of worms. Earthworms that we usually see in our soil that are here are burrowing worms, and they're big and they're fat and they dig really deep into the earth. And those aren't the ones that we use in a home composting system because they're not efficient for producing in processing food. We rely on the red wiggler because red wigglers live and feed on the top layers of soil, and they have different needs. You can't just then the earthworm. You can't dig an earthworm out of your garden, throw it in a worm bin and get started. you really need to have specialized worms. And worms are incredible, incredible animals, insects, whatever you want, or the creatures. And they really do the heavy lifting, earthworms as well as red wigglers. And they have special environmental conditions. They have needs. So when we're dealing with home composting with worms, we have to consider three things. They need a moist bedding, which is a number of things. And I'll talk about beddings. It has to be damp, but not soggy, sort of like a wrung out sponge, because worms breathe through their skin and they can't dry out. And as they move through, you have to keep the bedding moist through your bin. The ideal temperature for compost worms is between 65 and 78. I would not recommend you putting your worm bin outside in the summer in Virginia in the piping sun, because the worms will not survive. So for me, it is an indoor activity in the basement, in my laundry area, out of sight, out of mind. And also the worms need darkness and not direct light. What I want to show you next is a worm in action. This is a quick 1-minute video showing you how hard how hard the worms work and how efficient they are in breaking down food. So here we go. This is 1 week in the life of a compost bin. 1 minute time lapse of 2 weeks. So just watch how hard these worms work. They're top feeders, so you'll see them moving up, and watch that stack of household kitchen waste that we throw out usually. See how well it decomposes. Wow, wasn't that incredible? These are hardworking little creatures. How does the worm process work? I consider it a 3-step process. And this is stuff from my own home worm bin. First of all, you need to have food for the worms. Okay, so on the first step is to collect your food scraps from your kitchen as you're cooking, cleaning out your produce drawer, the back of the refrigerator, you know, an apple that you left, something that's really less than wonderful. These worms love it. They start using the decomposition process of the actual vegetables as part of their process for consuming the produce or whatever. So worms, you can feed a variety of things. Anything from coffee grounds in their filters, tea bags, just take the staples off if you have some with staples, egg shells that are crushed, any type of fruit or veggie scraps, peels, cores, moldy fruit from your vegetable bin, rotten bananas, whatever can be thrown in there. Rice and pasta in moderation, bread also. Then they're going to need bedding, things that they can live in, that they will eventually digest, but to add the balance between nitrogen, which is the fresh decaying vegetable organic matter, in the carbon, which is the newspaper, the egg cartons, TP rolls, the empty rolls from your paper towels, brown cardboard, okay? All of that stuff will go from this process here on the left, step number 1, and there's actually coffee grounds and filters and you can't think, to this beautiful product at the end, step number 3. And what you don't want to put in your worm bin is anything that will cause problems. No bones, no meat, nothing oily. I don't put dairy in mine, no pet waste, and limited amount of citrus and onions, because the acidity there, of course, it does not agree with the worms completely. Now, worms are really small. They only and they digest things slowly. So even though you put the food in, you don't want big, gigantic pieces of anything. You want to chop it up into small pieces. The cardboard, the egg cartons, the brown cardboard through your shredder or by hand pieces. And those will create the right balance for the worms to eat. So if you look over here, it's not the most beautiful site, but you can see on the right, step number 2, they're having lunch. These are worms, and there's newspaper on the top, and this brown stuff is the castings that they're making. So they go through and eat the vegetation and they poop it out. So castings is a fancy name for worm manure or worm poop. So we call it worm castings, and that's dense in nutrition because it has gone through the system of the worm. It's picked up beneficial organisms and other enzymes and things that really help the soil. So the end process does not look at all like my number 1 slide, my number 1 photo, which is the raw material I put in. And over time, it turns into a crumbly, dense, non-smelling worm wonder, which is vermicompost. And you use that in your garden. As I said, that my compost bin is in the laundry room. It doesn't make noise. And if we're doing it right, it's not going to smell. It's better than and easier than having other sorts of animals in your house. Okay. So how does a worm bin work? That's the first step. To get started, you need some sort of container. So there's many options. When I got started in the early 90s, I really didn't know what I was doing. And that was really before the internet took off as the wealth of information, and YouTube is not really available to give guidance. But right now in the 21st century, we are able to get so much information. So you have a lot of options. This is the type of system that I have here. It's a worm tower. And if you see it, it's a series of trays. It's a series of trays. And this is kind of old school. There's some cooler designs, but I just took a snap of this morning. This is like $300. You don't have to spend $300 to get the fancy high-tech one. You can make them yourself. That's the beauty of the system. You can buy a ready-made one, which I did a number of years ago. And it's holding up and it's fine. And I'll explain how this works in a minute. And you can make your own with do-it-yourself materials that you have on hand. Those Rubbermaid totes or anything that you have that can nest. So these are 2 Rubbermaid totes together. And it's going to be a flow-through system. And I'll talk about that in a minute. You can use, if you want to go a little bit bigger, stacked either big 10-gallon buckets, the orange Home Depot one. I think that's 10 gallons. Or even trash cans, 2 nesting in. This is actually a 3-level system. And they're not hard to make if you chose to go the do-it-yourself route. All you need is some sort of, not screwdriver, a drill and some patience. It's not, because what the worms are going to need is something like this. And this is just an example of how it's set up. For any container you have, probably the minimum you'd need is 2 levels. You feed at the top level and you have a cover because worms need darkness. And in the top level, this is the tray that I have, you need to have air circulation, okay? So worms need air, but they don't want light. So you need some sort of cover. You feed the worms in the top level. And through time, the worms will eat all of this. And if you have two-level tray, you empty this, you take out the worms, and you start another one. My system, I have 4 levels. So on mine here, I feed at the top, and then these are older ones still breaking down. You'll need some sort of opening in the bottom, like some holes so things can move through, especially the moisture. Because what's going to happen is some of this stuff is high water content. You need a way for it to drain in a collection system. Now this big green one on the left here, the newer one, it's a migration system, and all the compost falls automatically down. Mine, I have to take each tray out and empty it, and it's a rotation system with this. There's a storage area of some sort to collect the worm drippings, which is worm tea, and you can dilute that and use that with house plants. It's very rich in nutrients. The one thing you have to remember about this vermicompost is you're not needing a lot to have a big impact on the nutrition and health of your soil. For a planting in the spring, I have I'll put like a half a cup in a hole with a tomato plant, and that's more than enough nutrition to get that plant up and running and last pretty much through the growing season. So a little goes a long way with vermicompost. If you've ever purchased it or seen the cost of the dried vermicompost bags, it's at garden centers, you realize how much it would be easier to make your own and more economical. Okay, how do you get started making your own? You have your bin. You've decided on either a pre-made one or you're going to do it yourself. What the first thing you need is bedding, a place for the worms to live. So worms need moist, but a not soggy situation. You don't want to drown them. Their skin needs to breathe. They breathe through their skin, and they need to move, and they need a little bit of moisture. So it's like a damp sponge, wrung out sponge. So the type of materials you might need for bedding, you have to think about the high carbon to nitrogen ratio. So the nitrogen is all the stuff you feed it, all the greens, all the veggies. And the carbon would be newspaper, cardboard, plain brown corrugated cardboard, not glossy things. I start myself with a bedding of cocoa coir, which is recycled byproduct of coconuts, or you could use peat moss. And some people don't like peat moss because it's not as renewable. Cocoa coir is being substituted a lot because it is renewable. And this cocoa coir or peat moss holds moisture very well. Egg carton, cardboard egg cartons, old paper towel or toilet paper roll. So if I'm in the kitchen, I'm running out of, replacing my paper towels, I'll save the roll. I'll just shred it up with my hands and throw it in my vermicomposting tote that I keep for my scraps. You can use office paper shredded. You can use junk mail shredded. I would not do anything with glossy paper and anything that has those plastic envelope windows for the business correspondence you might get. I tend to stick with newspaper, cardboard, and milk cartons, and TP or paper towel rolls as they become available. The thing about bedding is you can't put in too much bedding. Bedding will help balance out the wet ingredients that you put in. If you don't have enough bedding, what happens is that the bin might heat up, which would cause an unpleasant environment for the worms. So remember, whenever you have bedding, you can replenish it as you go through. It's not a one-time thing. As you're adding food, you're adding a little bit of shredded something or other for bedding, okay? Okay, what about feeding? What can they eat, okay? The idea is that because they eat on the top layers, they stay kind of in the mid-level layer of your bin. And when the food is there, they'll come up to eat. So you want to bury your food 3 to 4 inches under the bedding. So it could be shredded newspaper that you've soaked in water and you've squeezed out all the moisture, or cardboard that you've wet and just made sure that it does not saturate it. They'll come up and eat. You don't want to feed them too much. This is where it gets a little bit tricky, and I can't give you exact amounts. Start small with your feeding. It's better to underfeed than overfeed, because many of the problems that you have in worm bins is due to too much food, and they can't handle the amount that you put in. So when you know you have a problem is if there's an odor or it's really, really soft and wet, the way to balance that out is to add more bedding, more shredded paper, a little bit more cardboard or other things to kind of absorb the moisture. The worms will regulate their reproduction based on the food. So if you underfeed them, it's okay. If you overfeed them, they're not going to be able to keep up with reproducing in order to handle the volume of food in there. And I promised my family that I would be honest about some of the side effects of under or overfeeding. Overfeeding creates problems like fruit flies or fungus gnats. And the best way to do that is to maintain feeding that is small initially until everything is balanced out, and keep your bin, the feeding bin, covered with wet, big pieces of wet newspaper or cardboard, sort of like make like a lid within the on top of the bin. And eventually they'll eat through all of that too. So as you saw in the quick video, worms love to eat. Composting worms love to eat. And they say about 1,000 worms, which is about a pound, will eat about half a pound of food every day. I do not feed my worms every day, and I don't measure anymore, weigh it to figure it out. But you have to be careful. Remember, worms don't have big teeth like we do. It's best that you chop up the food or even run it through the blender and that will speed up their ability to absorb and eat the food. Now, one thing that people say, well, what am I going to do when I want to go on vacation? I'm going away for 2 weeks. You do not have to worry about the time that you're gone. The worms can survive without regular feeding. They'll last many, many weeks. I haven't tested it completely, but without having food. It's not like your cat or your dog that you need someone to pet sit. These critters will take care of themselves. Okay. Now, you've waited, you've fed your worms, they've got a good balance of things. How do you know when it's time to harvest? When to collect your castings and share them with your garden and your houseplants? It's going to take approximately 4 to 6 weeks to produce castings or longer. It just depends on how much you put in, how many worms you have, and what kind of system you have. I don't check it regularly. I check it a couple of times a week, and I don't rush the process. When most of the food, I would say 99% of the food, you cannot identify, and the material in there looks brown or black and it smells earthy, you'll know when it's done. There'll still be worms living in that decomposed worm casting, but you can start harvesting. There might be some odd, like avocado peel, the outer, the peel of the avocado. Some of those things take a little bit longer to break down, but most of this stuff will be within 4 to 6 to 8 weeks done. Okay, I'm not going to go too much into how to harvest it, but there's basically 2 ways. One is you can take, if you've used the Rubbermaid tote type of thing, you take the feeding tray, you put down some a tarp or something plastic, and you dump out all of the worm castings. What happens is the worms do not like light, so they'll migrate down, which will help you when you can take off the top layer and sort it out, okay? The other way of doing it is that you only feed one side. So one side of the tray, one side of the bin, and then you stop feeding for about 2 weeks, and all of the food, because it's only on one side, the worms will move to that side of the bin, and you can harvest or remove the vermicompost from the side that was not fed. They're going to go to the food. With my tray, to be honest with you, after a while, I just take the whole thing, put it in a bucket, and when it's time for gardening season, I just put, if there's a few worms left, they join my garden with my vegetables, and I don't sort out anymore. But there's ways to do that, and it's easy, and it's not anything that's difficult. For storage, because this time of the year you're going to be creating compost and not necessarily using it in your garden, you can store vermicompost. This was my research about, and they said it should last for 3 years. I really don't think you're going to get the volume that you have to worry about storing it for 3 years. If you have a small garden, if you have house plants, outdoor pots in the summer, you're going to go through that vermicompost. It's going to be like everything else. There's never enough compost. So I don't think you have to worry too much about storage. But when you do store it in a bucket, you have something with a container, but make sure there's some air holes because you want a little bit of ventilation in there. And I store mine in old paint, paint buckets that I get at Home Depot with a lid, drill a few holes on the top, on the side. There's enough air in there that it keeps everything, because it's alive. There's enzymes, there's beneficial microbes, there's all sorts of things in that compost. So you want it to have some air to keep it alive. And I store it in a cool, dry place, which is usually my basement. It's important to remember when you have a worm bin, you can say, oh, well, it's nice out. I'm going to put my worm bin outside. I would recommend to keep it always in the same place. It needs the same temperature pretty much year round, because you want to keep that constant, 50 something to 60 something in that zone where it's cool but not cold. So let me see, what do I have? I know I've talked too much. So one of the things you might want to look at and read more in detail is the Virginia Cooperative Extension out of Virginia Tech has a wonderful resource called Composting Your Organic Kitchen Waste with Worms. That is one place to start for a basic introduction to it. And the other place, if you want to really get a little bit more information of the biology of the worm and how the beneficial organisms and everything else works, there was a wonderful webinar I watched out of University of Illinois Extension, a Master Gardener webinar, and that really got deep into the weeds about how the whole system works. One thing I want you to remember is that there's no right or wrong with vermicomposting. You'll learn by doing, and I would recommend that you start small. You can get a half a pound of worms online. There's many sources for places to purchase these, and start small. The worst that will happen is that if it doesn't work out for your lifestyle or for your needs, you have a little bit of compost and no major investment. Start small with what you have and use the internet for resources, because there's so many examples on how to do the bins, how to feed the worms once you have them. But it really is a wonderful opportunity for you to take some of our food waste that we have, that we generate normally in a regular kitchen, and bring it back to life. Bring it back into a way that will feed our soil, it will feed our planet, and feed our plants, because all of this stuff right now is just getting thrown down the garbage disposal into our sewage treatment plants, and we could get so much more out of those things that we call waste, become wonderful black gold for little or no effort. Okay. So, okay.
Yeah, thank you, Patricia. Thanks so much. Do we have any questions for Patricia? I see there's one that came in through the chat.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay.
Do you have, so do the worms reproduce so that, two questions. Do they ever over reproduce and then you have excess, or do you ever have to supplement them?
I've never had to supplement. They adjust to the amount of food that's in there. So if there's a lot of food, I think it increases their reproduction. If the food, they create a balance within the system. They're always reproducing, but if for some reason you're reducing the feeding, they'll reduce their population to match the amount of food you're putting in. Does that make sense? Yeah. The other thing is what happens is I just dump them in my regular compost bin in the summer once in a while, just to equalize things. Because you can have too many. And I can't always keep up with the green waste that I put in, because I try to put it in my outdoor regular composter too. So it's a balance. It's not anything I can give you a formula exactly. I'm sure there are formulas out there, but you'll know when there's a drop in population or a super increase. And the more food they have, they'll try to reproduce quicker. But it does take a couple of weeks for their life cycle. And they'll die if there's not enough food, that the older ones will die and become part of the compost.
Yeah.
Okay, we had another question from Linda. What's a good source to purchase these worms? Is it online?
Online, I use Uncle Jim's Worm Farm out of I think they're out of Pennsylvania. And I'm not sponsored by them, but that was the source that I used. They come in the mail and they come with instructions on how to do it. And they come pretty quickly once you place an order, and you place it by weight. So for a worm bin, either a half a pound or a pound to start with. And once you have them, then you can become your own worm farmer and give them to friends who want to start a worm bin. And that's the initial purchase, besides the actual plastic tubs. And I want to say about the plastic tubs, they need to be dark. You can't use the clear totes for this. You have to have one because they need darkness. That's the one thing I don't think I mentioned.